There's a spirituality in clay, and it has a memory. If I simply would take my fingerprint and print it into that clay, that fingerprint will be on that piece of clay for 10,000 years. And so there's a story to be told because the clay has remembered the mark. My dad is a scientist with a PhD in nuclear physics, and early on was developing the feeding systems for nuclear reactors. There were huge, terrible pollution problems in Los Angeles and in Tokyo. And he somehow figured out that by passing hot, polluted gases through a honeycomb structure of ceramics that was coated with platinum, that you could decrease the pollutant gases that are emitted from automobiles. I remember distinctly in my childhood him being invited to Congress in the United States a number of times and trying to convince the fuel industry. Imagine going up against, ExxonMobil and all these people. But I remember there was a lot of resistance and a lot of frustration. So he invented the catalytic converter for cars. We had 6 kids in our family. We all ended up going to college, but my parents' expectation was that I was supposed to be a doctor. My dad, he said that it's very difficult to make a living as an artist. But I met Warren MacKenzie, and he changed my life. Hello, Warren.
How are you?
Good. How are you? I was not going to be a doctor. I was stepping away from that. But I didn't tell my parents, so I continued on with my pre-med requirements. So I actually have a degree in biology, minor in chemistry, and a BFA. Bare spot.
Yeah.
And I took the ceramics class. Warren MacKenzie was teaching at the University of Minnesota. All wood ash in here from the... Warren, of course, studied with Bernard Leach. Bernard was a very significant participant in the Mingei group, the Art of the People, of artists that came out of the 1920s, 1930s. In 1953, Warren's wife, Alex, invited Leach and Yanagi and Hamada to come to St. Paul. They arranged a tour through the United States. It's quite famous. During that tour, they really changed the face of American ceramics.
Well, do you want to sit around here and chit-chat, or do you want to go down to the studio?
I remember as a young person in the studio struggling to be able to make pots like Warren and have them have that beautiful appearance like right off the wheel, and I could never do it. And I said, I tried so hard to be like Warren MacKenzie. Michael Simon, one of my classmates, said to me once, he said, I thought I was Warren MacKenzie. I have to say that Warren MacKenzie changed my life and my way of thinking about life and things. And I knew from the first moment that I touched clay and began to make pots that I wanted to be a potter and work in ceramics. For about 3 years after graduating from the university, as I sort of matured and worked in ceramics, I started to realize how much I didn't know in ceramics, trying to figure out how to wood fire. As far as I knew, there was nobody else in the United States working with wood kilns at the time. Warren professes not to know much about wood firing or how the kilns are fired, but he always talked about potters in Libourne having to chop up their furniture at some point in time to get the kiln up to temperature. And it's like, I don't have enough furniture in my house. So I talked to Michael Cardew. I wrote Michael Cardew a number of times, and he suggested I either go to France or go to Japan to learn wood firing. Naively enough, I was writing letters to Japanese people in English, and I'm sure they opened them up and went, what the heck is this? And no translation. And it wasn't until 1975 when Shimaoka was coming through Minneapolis and St. Paul, and he was stopping in Minneapolis to visit Taiko and Shin Tanaka. And Taiko Tanaka is a potter, and she called me up and invited me to come to a dinner with Shimaoka. I remember hanging up the phone. I said, of course I'll come. And about 30 seconds later, I picked up the phone and I said, Taiko, I said, I've been wanting to go to Japan. Can I pick out some pots and come early to the dinner and show them to Shimaoka and ask him if I can apprentice with him? And she said, oh, I think that'll be okay. So you imagine my angst picking out the pots that I was going to represent myself to Shimaoka. I remember I knocked on her door and she opened it, and I put down my box of pots and she gave me a big hug and she said, it's all arranged, you can go. And I said, well, he hasn't even seen my pots. And she said, don't worry, it's all arranged, you can go. That experience forever changed my life as a young potter. I was 25 years old at the time. I had the enviable house of living between Shimaoka and Hamada, about 200 yards in each direction. Shimaoka was just a wonderful human being. He had 12 people working for him at the pottery. I met Ken Matsuzaki there. He was Shimaoka's apprentice. And Ken and I have had a lifelong friendship since that time. I had great trepidation about meeting Hamada, and Atsuya, his son, came over to my home and he said, my father needs to speak with you immediately. And I said, Atsuya, what does Hamada need to talk to me about? And he said, you must come immediately with me. He needs to speak with you. Atsuya said, well, he's been invited to an audience with the Queen of England, and he needs you to teach him the Queen's English. And I said, well, I'm an American, Atsuya. I don't know the Queen's English, and I can't help him. He must come. So I went, and it was funny, a very humbling experience. But Hamada looked at me, and he wanted to know what kind of gift he should give the Queen of England. And I said, well, I don't know the Queen of England, sensei, but I said, I think you should give her one of your pieces. And his concern was that gift good enough for her in the audience? I remember being one of the younger people there, and I wanted something important to do, but Shimaoka said, well, I want you to sit next to me and you will stir my iron glaze. And I thought, oh, this is a crappy job. I want to do something important. But I came to realize that was like probably one of the best spots I'd ever been placed in my life, because as the pots came down the line through the workers, glazed and clean, he would decorate each one. As I was finishing up my 6 months there, he offered me a portion of a chamber to make and fire my own work. And I remember he said to me, he said, now you've been making my pots for 4 months or 5 months, and now you should put your experiences to work and, demonstrate what you've learned. So then I came back to the United States and, I tore down my kiln immediately, rebuilt the Noborigama based on his kiln designs. It's the same shape and proportion, it's just not quite as wide as his kiln. So this is the Noborigama. This is the first chamber and the second chamber, and then there's another small gas kiln up behind it. The kiln that Shimaoka had, that was really the first wood kiln that I had ever seen, was this style of kiln, and it's an old Bizen style Noborigama. You can fire this kiln start to finish in about 26 hours if you wanted to, but we fire for about 70 hours. It's an old friend. We call our Anagama the raging adolescent, because it's can be a pain in the butt. It's just really temperamental and hard to control and kind of raging. People began to come here to experience wood firing, and we would always have people from all over the United States and other countries in the world would come here because they'd heard about this kiln to learn how to fire. In a way, it was the beginning of my teaching. I met Jan. I probably shouldn't say this because Jan's mom once said, well, you shouldn't date your professors. But I was 26 and I met Jan at a summer workshop that I was teaching for the University of Minnesota. And she fell in love with the idea of my love of Japan, my love of wood firing, and came out, and that's how we ended up being together. It's amazing how one can lose a tool and not move anywhere.
This will be the outtakes.
Did you steal it? Did you steal it this morning?
In my studio for days.
She often steal your...
Yeah, she often does. Usually when I can't find it. Jan calls it male blindness. Jan and I have a wonderful relationship. I consider her to be my soulmate. It's not that there aren't difficult days or times in the studio, but generally we get along fairly well. We have a policy of we don't collaborate on each other's work, so we just decided a long time ago we're not going to be in that position ever where we have to collaborate on each other's work. And in our new studio, one of the first days in the studio, we were walking and then Jan points down and she said, do you see this crack in the floor? Don't cross this line. I think a lot of potters probably have a very solitary life, working in the studio and mixing glazes by themselves and loading kilns by themselves. And Jan and I share that. And we work well together, so that's good. So, I carried on here and making pots, and everybody that came said, oh, your pots are so Japanese, they have such a Japanese influence. I began to sort of look at that as almost a criticism rather than a compliment. And I decided at that time to try to step away as much as I could in my aesthetic and my thinking process from Japanese art. Hamada once said to me, don't just make my pots, or don't just look at my pots. He said, look at my sources. And, that's been a huge lesson for me in life. Go back to the beginning, look at what those artists were looking at. What was Cezanne looking at? What was Matisse, looking at? I'm personally attracted to probably more primitive art, so I went to England the first time when I was 18 years old and managed to make it to Stonehenge. No fences at the time, you could walk up and touch the stones, and very curious about that. Studying primitivism in art, I think led me into African art eventually, and I can pretty much jump from very primitive art and skip over lots of things like the Renaissance. And I love Impressionism, of course, and paintings of Cezanne. And I'm very curious kind of how primitive art influenced modernism. And it influenced a number of artists that I have great admiration for, and Henry Moore and Giacometti and Picasso and Matisse. And all those artists began to look at art from Africa, coming through Paris and coming into London. And it set the stage for the jump to abstraction. And I'm very curious, of that moment in time. Mingei group comes kind of in the 1920s, so not too far away from that group. And, the tenets that are established in that, in my work especially, I think, comes from those early influences. Brancusi and Modigliani are two big heroes of mine, and I like the simplification. Those were my influences. In 1978-9, there was a recession in the United States, and our second son was born, and there was some difficulty, and he was in the hospital for a while, and I had some insurmountable medical bills. So I needed to make some money, and I wasn't going to be able to do that just working in the pottery. So I started to do large stone and brick fireplaces for the architect that has designed elements of our house and elements of Warren's house, Mike McGuire. And I ended up having 3 employees, and got my way out of debt. I made money. And I was being booked out almost a year and a half in advance for jobs. I was still working in the pottery, but probably more treading water, if it's a descriptive term, as needed. And then I was invited to teach at Emily Carr School of Art in Vancouver. And I went out there to teach, and on the way back, Jan said, you're wasting your life doing sorry, get emotional here, but she said, you're wasting your life doing this brickwork and stonework. She said, you need to get back into your artwork full time. But I realized we had 2 children and Jansen artists, and I thought, I need to maintain an income. So I decided to try to get a job teaching at the university. I taught for 26 years. I love being able to talk about what I love to do, and that's the joy of teaching. And I had some incredible students over the years, and managed to build a very significant program at the University of Wisconsin in River Falls. Students love to come and fire our wood kilns with us, and we have the 2 large wood kilns, and the Anagama we typically fire with 26 people. This is the Anagama. The Naborigama, we usually have 10 to 15 people involved in it, and this is a much sort of longer, more detailed. We use probably between $1,500 and $3,000 worth of wood, depending on when I buy it and how I buy it. And we load it as a group, and then everybody signs up for shifts, and we typically have 4 to 6 people on a shift for 6 hours each. We run 4 shifts a day. It's kind of like firing with a village, but a kiln that size, you can't possibly do the physical labor by yourself, so you have to have people come and help. Jan said, when I told her I was going to build this, she goes, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy?" My teaching, that's been a very positive thing. And it's also very rewarding to see kind of the number of people who have chosen to do this in their lives and have been successful at it. And you know, it's kind of like passing the torch. If we don't try to make a change in other people's lives or be inclusive in the philosophy of teaching or sharing, then you know, it's not going to move forward. I don't think art will ever die in humanity, but I think often of what Shimaoka did for me, what Hamada did for me, and just being generous as a person, what Warren has done for me. It's my opportunity to give back to the people that I come in contact with, and you know, want to share kind of my studio and love for art with them. You know, I really believe that the artistic experience of humanity sort of carries the history of humanity forward in time. You know, in school we kind of jump from Napoleon to, you know, Hitler to Afghanistan or whatever, and that's what's taught in history classes. But the real history of humanity is through their art, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that. I have some quite old pots that are very meaningful to me that I've collected along the way, and one of them I got in Chicago. It's an old Korean bowl. It's probably 17th, 18th century. And when it was one of those pieces, when I walked into the antique shop, caught my eye right away. It's like I always say, that pot grabbed me, and it wanted to come and live in my house. I picked it out and looked at it, and I began to talk to the shopkeeper and found out that the bowl had come from a colonel or a general in the army that had been in the Korean War, and they had brought this back, and then the family didn't want it anymore, so they put it up for sale in this antique shop. I started to look at the rim of the piece, and I noticed that there were finger marks on the rim of the piece like this, and there were finger marks here, and they're quite subtle. And then the potter dipped it in the glaze, did that, and dripped it out. And so that night I put my fingers on the pot. You know, I sort of felt this chill go down my arms. I get a little bit of a chill talking about it now, but a long time ago a woman criticized me for leaving finger marks in the glaze. You know, it's poor craftsmanship. But I always think about that ball, and I very deliberately leave finger marks in the glaze now. That fingerprint will be on that piece of clay for 10,000 years. And so there's a story to be told, because the clay has remembered the mark. Best decisions I ever made in my life was to become an artist, and it's exciting to me every day. I can't wait to get back in the studio and be kind of making and drawing and doing new things. A lot of falling on my face there too, but it's a good thing. Yeah, very proud of my dad. And he's very inventive, and so he's still alive. He's 95, and at age 92, he received 2 more patents. He did tell me not too many years ago that he had wanted to become an artist. He never told me that before. He has a number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that have chosen to become artists, and they become fairly, renowned photographers and writers, and so there's a very strong artistic element that goes through the family. But he said that in his time, it's very difficult to make a living as an artist. It's a long, difficult road, and I've always told my students, if you can do something else, do it, because it's one of the most difficult things you will ever choose to do in your life. But I think if you're compelled to work in art, you have to do it.